My son slammed the door and said, "You're just a guest here." I packed my things and froze their bank account. It was one of those quiet Tuesdays in the Chicago suburbs where the only sound was the rustle of autumn leaves and the distant hum of a neighbor's lawnmower cutting through the September air. The kind of day that used to bring me peace, back when this house felt like home instead of a stage where I performed the role of the grateful, invisible mother-in-law. I stood in the kitchen, wiping flour from my hands onto my old blue floral apron, the same one I'd worn for 23 years, the one with tiny frayed edges that told stories of countless meals prepared with love, countless holidays celebrated, countless moments of quiet devotion that had somehow become expected rather than appreciated. The air was thick with the scent of yeast and cinnamon as I pulled the last batch of dinner rolls from the oven, those same rolls that had been David's favorite since he was 7 years old. Running into the kitchen with grass-stained knees and chocolate smudges on his cheeks, asking if they were ready yet with the impatience that only children possess. Back then, his eyes would light up when he saw me baking. He'd climb onto the counter stool and watch me work, asking endless questions about measurements and timing, sometimes stealing tastes of raw dough despite my gentle scolding. "Why do you put salt in sweet bread, Mom?" he'd ask, his small fingers tracing patterns in the flour I'd spilled on the counter. "Because sweetness alone isn't enough, sweetheart." I'd tell him, not knowing how prophetic those words would become. A little salt makes everything else taste better. It brings out the true flavors. Now, as I looked at those same rolls cooling on the rack, I wondered when he'd stopped tasting the love I baked into every batch. When had my offerings become invisible, expected, taken for granted like the air he breathed or the roof over his head? This was my ritual, my quiet language of love in a house where words had become scarce and sharp-edged. I'd wake at 5:30 every morning. Just as the first hints of dawn crept through the kitchen windows that I'd hung with curtains I'd sewn myself yellow gingham that Paul had picked out because he said it made the room feel like sunshine. The morning routine was sacred to me. Coffee, first dark roast, the way my late husband Paul had liked it, strong enough to wake the dead, but smooth enough to sip slowly while watching the world come alive. Then breakfast for 3, though I was the only one who seemed to appreciate the effort anymore. I'd set the table with care, using the good plates on weekends, the everyday ones during the week, but always with cloth napkins because Paul had taught me that small dignities mattered. I'd arrange fresh flowers from the garden when they were in season, or a small bowl of fruit when they weren't, because a table should be beautiful as well as functional. These tiny acts of grace had once been noticed, complimented, appreciated. Now they were simply expected, like the sunrise or the changing of seasons. In the living room, my daughter-in-law Marina was directing the installation of a new coffee table, sleek glass and chrome, all sharp angles and cold surfaces that seemed designed to cut rather than comfort. It looked completely out of place against our old oak floors, the same floors that Paul and I had refinished with our own hands 32 years ago, working late into summer evenings while baby David napped upstairs. We'd rented the Sanders on a Friday afternoon, spending the entire weekend on our hands and knees, breathing sawdust and sharing dreams about the life we were building together. "Someday this house will be full of grandchildren," Paul had said, running his hand along a newly smooth plank. "Can you imagine little feet running across these floors?" I had imagined it. For years, I'd imagined it. But grandchildren required children who respected their elders, who valued family, who understood that love was something to be nurtured rather than exploited. Instead, I got Marina's minimalist aesthetic and David's casual cruelty. But I said nothing about the coffee table. I had learned to say nothing about many things. I had mastered the art of occupying small spaces, moving along the edges of rooms like a shadow, careful not to disrupt their carefully curated aesthetic. When had I become so small? When had I learned to apologize for my own existence in the house I'd helped build? Marina clicked into the kitchen on her stilettos, the sound sharp against the ceramic tiles I'd chosen back when this house was still mine in more than just legal documents. She'd insisted on wearing heels even at home, claiming they made her feel put together. I suspected they were really armor, a way to add inches not just to her height, but to her sense of superiority. She wrinkled her nose at the warm, yeasty air that filled the kitchen like an embrace. "Anna, we agreed no baking during the week. The smell is too domestic. It doesn't match our minimalist vibe." Her voice carried that particular tone she'd perfected, not quite harsh enough to be called cruel, but cold enough to sting. "Plus, David's trying to cut carbs. This kind of temptation isn't helpful." I didn't respond, just nodded and slid the cooling racks into the pantry where the evidence of my existence could be hidden away. Too domestic. The phrase echoed in my mind as I closed the pantry door. My life, my sense, my memories, none of it matched their new world, built inside walls that I had helped raise, brick by brick, payment by payment, dream by dream. The transformation hadn't happened overnight. When Paul died 5 years ago from a sudden heart attack at 62, too young, too sudden, too cruel for a man who'd never missed a day of work or forgotten an anniversary, David had been devastated. We all had been. The funeral had been standing room only, filled with colleagues and neighbors and friends who'd known Paul as a man of integrity, kindness, and quiet strength. In those first raw months of grief, David had moved back home with Marina, ostensibly to help me through the darkness, to make sure I wasn't alone in this big house that suddenly felt cavernous without Paul's booming laugh echoing through the halls. For the first year, it had been a genuine comfort. David would sit with me on the porch swing that Paul had built with his own hands, and we'd watch the sunset paint the sky in shades of amber and rose, just like Paul and I used to do every evening when the weather allowed. "Tell me about Dad when he was young," David would say, and I'd share stories about the man he'd known as father, but not as the boy who'd courted me with wildflowers and handwritten poetry, who'd proposed on a park bench during a thunderstorm because he couldn't wait for better weather to start our life together. But somewhere along the way, so gradually I barely noticed until it was complete comfort became convenience. Help became entitlement. Gratitude became expectation. The son who had once asked permission to bring friends over for dinner now made decisions about my home without consulting me. The daughter-in-law who had once thanked me for every meal now critiqued my cooking choices as if I were the hired help rather than the woman who'd owned this house before she was born. It started with small things, Marina suggesting I modernize my decorating style, David recommending I streamline my possessions, both of them speaking about me in the third person while I was in the room, as if I were a problem to be solved rather than a person to be respected. "She has so much stuff," Marina would say, looking around the living room filled with photographs and mementos and books, evidence of a life fully lived. "It's cluttered, overwhelming. We really need to help her pare down." Pare down. As if my memories were excess baggage rather than treasures. As if the photograph of Paul and me on our wedding day was visual noise rather than a reminder of the love that had built this family. As if the ceramic bowl David had made in third-grade art class was clutter rather than a priceless artifact of motherhood. That evening at dinner, quinoa salad and grilled chicken breast, their preferred health-conscious fare that left me hungry for the hearty pot roasts and casseroles that had sustained our family for decades, David launched into an animated discussion about vacation plans. Bali. 2 weeks at a luxury resort with spa treatments and private beach access, and guided tours of temples that cost more per day than most families spent on food for a month. He spoke about it with Marina, their voices bright with excitement, their eyes meeting across the table in shared anticipation, while they looked through me as if I were an empty chair, a piece of furniture that happened to be occupying space. The conversation flowed around me like water around a stone, as if my presence was simply part of the landscape rather than a choice deserving acknowledgement. "The resort has 3 pools," Marina gushed, showing David pictures on her phone. "An infinity pool, a lap pool, and one just for relaxation. And look at this spa menu: hot stone massages, couples treatments, meditation sessions at sunrise." "We deserve this," David said, reaching across the table to squeeze her hand. "After everything we've been through this year, we need some time to reconnect, to recharge." Everything they'd been through, as if living rent-free in a fully furnished house while having all major expenses covered was a hardship requiring tropical recovery. as if being handed financial security on a silver platter was a burden that needed to be soothed with luxury vacations. I sat quietly, methodically chewing food that tasted like cardboard, listening to them calculate budgets and excursion costs with the casual confidence of people who'd never had to choose between paying rent and buying groceries. "Money's not an issue," David said, gesturing expansively with his fork. "Thank God we can pull from the family account for whatever we need." The family account, that's what they called it now, as if it were some magical, self-replenishing well that bubbled up money from the earth itself. They had forgotten or perhaps chosen to forget who had dug that well, bucket by bucket, dollar by dollar, through decades of 60-hour work weeks and careful savings and deliberate sacrifices. Paul and I had both been engineers in mechanical systems, designing the infrastructure that kept buildings safe and functional. I in software development back when women in tech were as rare as unicorns and twice as scrutinized. We'd met at Northwestern during my senior year, two scholarship kids who understood the value of hard work and delayed gratification. While our classmates partied and accumulated debt, we studied and saved and planned for a future that seemed both distant and urgent. Our first date had been to the campus library. Not because we were particularly academic, but because it was free and quiet, and Paul wanted to hear me talk about my thesis project without the distractions of crowds or music or alcohol. He listened with genuine interest as I explained my work on database optimization, asking thoughtful questions that proved he was paying attention not just to my words but to my passion for the subject. "You light up when you talk about solving problems," he'd said as we walked back to my dorm through the autumn evening. "It's like watching someone discover fire." That was Paul, a man who saw beauty in competence, who appreciated intelligence as much as any physical attribute, who made me feel valuable for my mind as well as my heart. When we married 2 years later, in a simple ceremony in the college chapel with both sets of parents and a handful of close friends as witnesses, we pooled our resources and our dreams, building something solid and lasting from the ground up. We honeymooned in Wisconsin, camping in state parks and cooking over campfires, not because we couldn't afford better, but because we wanted to start our marriage the way we planned to continue it, simply, authentically, focused on each other rather than on impressing anyone else. The house had been our first major purchase, a modest 3-bedroom colonial in need of serious work but with good bones and enormous potential. We'd spent weekends stripping wallpaper, painting rooms, installing fixtures, transforming it into our sanctuary one project at a time. Every improvement was a conversation, every decision was mutual, every dollar spent was carefully considered and jointly approved. When David was born 2 years later, after 8 hours of labor that Paul endured with me, holding my hand and feeding me ice chips and telling me jokes to distract from the pain, I'd taken maternity leave and returned to work part-time, but I never stopped contributing to our financial security. Even when Paul's consulting business took off and money became more comfortable, I maintained my own career, my own retirement account, my own sense of financial independence. A woman should never be dependent on anyone else for her security. My mother had told me when I was young, and even though Paul was the most dependable man I'd ever known, I took that advice to heart. I worked not because we needed the money, though we always used it wisely, but because I needed to know I could take care of myself and my family if circumstances required it. We weren't flashy people. We drove reliable cars until they couldn't be repaired anymore, maintaining them carefully and buying quality used vehicles rather than flashy new ones. We took modest vacations to state parks and rented cabins, teaching David to appreciate nature and simple pleasures rather than expecting luxury and entertainment. We bought quality items that would last rather than trendy pieces that would be replaced in a year, furniture that could be passed down, appliances that came with long warranties, clothes that improved with age rather than fell apart after a few washings. Every extra dollar went into investments, education funds for David, and eventually the family trust that had become the foundation of David and Marina's comfortable lifestyle. We weren't rich in the way our neighbors might have defined wealth: no second homes, or luxury cars, or designer wardrobes, but we were secure in a way that money couldn't buy. We had each other, we had stability, and we had the knowledge that we were building something lasting. Paul died on a Thursday morning in March, collapsed in our driveway while getting the newspaper, something he'd done every morning for 30 years, rain or shine. Because he believed in supporting local journalism and staying informed about the world beyond our doors. The doctor said it was instant, a massive heart attack that gave him no time to suffer, no time to be afraid. I suppose there was mercy in that, but it didn't make the loss any easier to bear. The funeral arrangements, the paperwork, the endless stream of casseroles from neighborsit, all passed in a blur of grief so profound I could barely function. David stepped up during those first few weeks, handling details and making decisions and being the son I'd raised him to be. But grief does strange things to people, and for David, it seemed to awaken a sense of entitlement that had been dormant while his father was alive. Paul had been the disciplinarian in our family, the one who set boundaries and enforced consequences. Not harshly, he'd never raised his voice to David or to me, but firmly, with the kind of quiet authority that comes from genuine confidence. When David had wanted to drop out of college to pursue a career as a musician, Paul had listened respectfully to his arguments and then calmly explained why finishing his degree was non-negotiable. "Dreams are important," Paul had said, "but so is having something to fall back on. Finish school first, then chase your music. The education will always be there, but opportunities don't wait for the unprepared." David had grumbled and argued, but he'd finished his degree. And when his music career failed to materialize, not from lack of talent, but from lack of persistence, he'd been grateful for his engineering background and the job market it opened up. With Paul gone, I'd become the sole voice of reason in David's life, but I'd never been comfortable with confrontation. Where Paul had been firm but gentle, I was either silent or sharp, either avoiding conflict entirely or letting resentment build until I exploded. It was a dynamic that invited exploitation, and David, perhaps unconsciously, at first began to test boundaries that had never been tested before. The breaking point came on a Wednesday that started like any other. I was in the garden, tending to Paul's hydrangeas, massive, blue-purple blooms that he'd planted the year David was born, talking to them like old friends as he watered and pruned. "These flowers are going to outlive us all," he'd joke every spring when they burst into bloom, "and they'll be more beautiful than ever." These plants were his legacy, his ongoing conversation with the earth. He'd spent hours researching the best soil amendments, the proper pruning techniques, the ideal balance of sun and shade. They'd grown tall and heavy over the years, requiring careful staking to prevent the branches from breaking under their own magnificent weight. Every spring, when they bloomed, I felt like Paul was still with me, still tending to the beauty we'd created together. I was tying up a particularly laden branch with soft garden twine, the kind Paul had special ordered because regular rope was too harsh for delicate stems when I heard the crunch of gravel behind me. David stood at the edge of the garden bed, his arms crossed, his face wearing that expression of barely contained irritation that had become all too familiar over the past few months. "Mom, what are you doing out here?" His voice carried an edge that made me straighten up, my hands still clutching the twine, dirt under my fingernails from the morning's work. "Just tying up the hydrangeas, sweetheart. This branch was getting heavy, and I didn't want it to break under its own weight. Your father always said." Marina hired a landscape designer. He cut me off mid-sentence, something he'd never done when Paul was alive. "He's coming tomorrow morning to assess the property and make recommendations. Don't touch anything else. You're interfering with his vision." The word interfering hit me like a physical blow. I looked at the hydrangeas, at the rose bushes I'd nursed through harsh winters and summer droughts, at the vegetable garden where I'd grown tomatoes and basil and herbs that had flavored thousands of family meals. Interfering. With whose vision? In whose garden? "David, this is your father's garden. I've been caring for it for 37 years. These plants are like family to me. I know every root system, every blooming pattern, every seasonal need. A landscape designer doesn't know this garden's history." "That was then," he said curtly, his voice growing harder with each word. "This is now. This is our house, and we're making it work for our lifestyle. Your gardening doesn't fit the aesthetic we're going for." Something shifted inside me, no anger, exactly, but a kind of crystalline clarity that I hadn't felt in years. It was as if I'd been looking at my life through fog, and suddenly the air had cleared, revealing a landscape I barely recognized. This is my house too, David. I live here. These are my gardens too. He stepped closer, his face flushing with sudden fury. Perhaps it was the quiet firmness in my voice, so different from the accommodating tone I'd used for months. Perhaps it was simply that I had finally pushed back against the slow erosion of my place in this family. Whatever it was, it triggered something ugly in him that I'd never seen before, something that made me wonder how long he'd been hiding this resentment behind polite facades. "No," he said, his voice rising to a volume that would have prompted Paul to issue a warning about respect and appropriate behavior. "This is our house, Marina's and mine. We pay the bills, we make the decisions, we live here, and you." He paused, searching for words that would cut deepest, words designed to wound rather than communicate. "You're just a guest here, do you understand? A guest, and it's time you started acting like one." The words hung in the air between us like poison gas, invisible but deadly. A guest. In the house where I'd brought my newborn son home from the hospital, walking carefully up these same front steps while Paul carried the car seat and fumbled with keys, both of us giddy with exhaustion and overwhelming love. A guest in the house where I'd spent countless nights in the rocking chair, nursing David through ear infections and nightmares and growing pains. A guest in the house where I'd held Paul's hand during his final days of illness, whispering promises about taking care of our son, about keeping our family together. David turned on his heel and stalked back toward the house, leaving me standing among the hydrangeas with dirt under my fingernails and the word guest ringing in my ears like a bell tolling the end of something precious and irreplaceable. I didn't cry, I didn't rage, I didn't follow him inside to argue or plead or try to make him understand what those words had done to me. Instead, I carefully finished tying the hydrangea branch, gathered my gardening tools with the methodical precision that Paul had taught me, and went inside to my bedroom, the same bedroom I'd shared with Paul for 3 decades, where we'd whispered about dreams and fears and the future we were building together. I sat on the edge of the bed and looked around at the room that had once been the heart of my world. The dresser where Paul had kept his wallet and keys, still holding his reading glasses, and the small notebook where he'd jotted down quotes from books he enjoyed. The reading chair where I'd nursed David through midnight fevers, singing lullabies that my own mother had sung to me. The window that looked out over the garden we'd planted together, season after season, year after year, creating beauty from bare earth and boundless hope. Guest, the word echoed in my mind like a mantra of dismissal. Guest in the house where I'd celebrated every Christmas morning for 34 years, where I'd cooked Thanksgiving dinners for extended family and friends, where I'd hosted baby showers and graduation parties and anniversary celebrations. Guest in the house where every piece of furniture told a story, where every room held memories, where every corner reflected choices Paul and I had made together. But as I sat there, instead of grief, I felt something unexpected, relief. The pretense was over. The careful dance we'd all been doing for years, pretending this arrangement was temporary, pretending it was mutual, pretending I still had a voice in my own home, all of that could stop now. David had said out loud what had been true for months. I was no longer welcome in my own life. The truth was liberating in a way I hadn't expected. For months, I'd been trying to make myself smaller, quieter, less intrusive, hoping that if I just accommodated enough, compromised enough, disappeared enough, I could find a way to belong in the life I'd built. But you can't negotiate your way back into your own existence. You can't earn respect from people who've decided you don't deserve it. You can't love someone into valuing you if they've chosen to see you as disposable. That evening, I didn't cook dinner. For the first time in decades, I didn't set the table or ask about their day or pretend to be interested in their vacation plans or their landscape designer or their minimalist aesthetic. I didn't apologize for existing, didn't make myself available for whatever casual cruelty they might decide to dispense. Instead, I went to my desk, the small antique writing desk that had been my grandmother's, where I'd written thank you notes and birthday cards and letters to distant relatives for 40 years. I pulled out a folder I hadn't touched in years, a thick blue folder labeled Morrison Family Trust in Paul's careful handwriting. He'd been meticulous about record-keeping, filing every document in clearly labeled folders, creating systems that would outlast both of us. Inside were the original trust documents, bank statements, investment summaries, and correspondence with our financial advisors, a paper trail of careful planning and responsible stewardship that spanned decades. Paul had been the strategist, but I had been the one who understood the legal details. When his business had really taken off in 1997, a breakthrough contract that had transformed his small consulting firm into a major player in industrial design, we hadn't bought luxury cars or taken exotic vacations or moved to a more prestigious neighborhood. Instead, we'd done what responsible people do. We'd protected our assets and planned for the future. The family trust had been my idea, actually a way to shelter money from taxes while ensuring that David would be provided for without becoming entitled or lazy. I'd spent months researching different options, consulting with attorneys and financial planners, learning about estate law and tax implications, and the psychology of inherited wealth. Money should serve the family, not rule it, I'd told the lawyer back then, a distinguished older gentleman who'd listened patiently as I outlined my concerns. And it should never be taken for granted. I've seen too many families destroyed by children who never learned the value of work, who never understood that wealth is a responsibility as much as a privilege. The attorney had nodded approvingly. You're wise to think about these things while you're still young and healthy. Too many people wait until it's too late to put proper structures in place. Paul and I had both been trustees with equal authority. The trust was designed to provide for David's education, help with major life expenses like a first home purchase or wedding costs, and eventually become his inheritance when we were gone. But it was also designed with safeguards, checks, and balances that would prevent irresponsible spending or entitlement. When Paul died, I'd become the sole trustee, with David and Marina listed as beneficiaries. They received monthly distributions that covered their mortgage, car payments, insurance, and basic living expenses, all the major costs that allowed them to live comfortably on their own modest salaries from the consulting firm where they both worked. They had access to a debit card for household expenses, funded by the trust, which they used for groceries, dining out, entertainment, and the countless small purchases that make life comfortable. But here's what they'd forgotten. In their comfortable assumption that this money was simply theirs by right, the trust was revocable. Section 11, subsection 4, paragraph 2, written in the precise legal language that Paul had insisted upon. The trustee reserves the right to suspend or terminate distributions to any beneficiary at her sole discretion without cause or explanation. Should she determine that such distributions are not serving the best interests of the beneficiary or the family unit. Paul had insisted on that clause during one of our many meetings with the attorney. Anna, he'd said, covering my hand with his work, roughened one, you're too generous for your own good. What if David turns out to be a spendthrift? What if he marries someone who takes advantage? What if success goes to his head and he forgets where he came from? You need to have an escape hatch, just in case. I'd resisted the idea at first. It seemed too harsh, too controlling, too pessimistic about our son's character. But Paul had been insistent, and his reasoning had been sound. Power corrupts, and money is the ultimate power. Without consequences, without the possibility of loss, generosity becomes enablement, and support becomes manipulation. We're not doing him any favors if we teach him that money appears without effort, Paul had argued. The best gift we can give him is the knowledge that respect and responsibility go hand in hand. I'd never imagined I would need to use that clause. Even during David's difficult teenage years, when he'd tested boundaries and challenged authority and made the kinds of mistakes that all young people make, I'd never doubted his fundamental character. He'd been raised to value hard work and treat people with respect. He'd been taught that privilege came with responsibility, that family was sacred, that love was demonstrated through action rather than words. But people change, circumstances change, And sometimes the child you raised with such care and hope grows into someone you barely recognize, someone who sees your love as weakness and your generosity as foolishness. That night, listening to their laughter drifting up from the living room as they planned their Balinese adventure with my money, browsing vacation photos on their laptops and debating excursion packages that cost more than most people's monthly salaries, I made a decision that would change all our lives forever. I called James Henderson, our wealth management advisor, a distinguished gentleman in his 70s who had handled the Morrison family finances for over 2 decades. James had been Paul's choice, recommended by a colleague who'd praised his discretion, his competence, and his understanding that money was a tool for living well rather than an end in itself. But first, I packed. Not everything. Not the photo albums filled with memories of happier times, not my mother's china that had graced our holiday tables for 30 years, not the rocking chair where I'd sung lullabies to baby David. Just one suitcase with enough clothes for a week, my important documents, a photograph of Paul in his favorite silver frame, the one where he's laughing at something I'd said during our anniversary dinner, and that blue folder that contained the power to reshape my world. Packing was both simple and profound. Each item I chose represented a choice about what mattered, what I could live without, what I needed to carry forward into whatever came next. I took practical things: underwear, medications, my warmest sweater, and sentimental things: Paul's wedding ring, which I'd worn on a chain around my neck since his death, and the small wooden box where I kept his letters from our courtship. I wrote a note, not a letter, not an explanation, just a simple statement of fact that captured the truth of what had happened without drama or accusation. I left it on Marina's new glass coffee table, the one that didn't belong in my living room, weighted down with the small ceramic bowl that David had made in 3rd grade art class. Guests usually leave when they're no longer welcome. Thank you for the hospitality, Anna. At 10:30 that night, I called a taxi and rode through the quiet suburban streets to a small hotel near O'Hare Airport. The driver was a young man who spoke with an accent I couldn't place, and he asked no questions about why a 71-year-old woman was traveling alone with a single suitcase at nearly midnight. I checked in under my maiden name, Anna Catherine Sullivan, and, for the first time in 5 years, I slept through the night without worrying about anyone else's needs or schedule or comfort. The hotel room was anonymous but clean, with white walls and generic furniture, and the kind of silence that comes from being completely alone with your own thoughts. I lay in the unfamiliar bed, listening to the distant sound of airplanes taking off and landing, and felt something I hadn't experienced in years: peace. Not happiness, exactly, but the deep satisfaction that comes from making a decision that aligns with your deepest values. The next morning, at exactly 9 o'clock, I dialed James Henderson's direct line. He answered on the second ring, his voice warm and professional, tinged with the slight surprise that came from hearing from a client who usually preferred to handle business through written correspondence. "Anna, what a pleasant surprise. How can I help you today?" "James," I said, my voice steady and calm, carrying the authority that comes from absolute certainty, "I'm calling about the Morrison Family Trust. I need to exercise my rights under Section 11, subsection 4. I'm suspending all distributions and freezing all accounts for beneficiaries David and Marina Morrison, effective immediately." The silence on the other end of the line stretched for several seconds. I could almost hear him flipping through the trust documents, refreshing his memory of the provisions we'd discussed so many years ago. Finally, James cleared his throat delicately. "Anna, this is quite significant. Are you certain this is the course you want to take? This will affect their mortgage payments, their car loans, their credit cards, essentially, their entire financial life." "I understand the implications perfectly," I replied, "and yes, I'm absolutely certain. Please send the paperwork to the Radisson at O'Hare. I'll be waiting." "Very well. I'll have everything prepared within the hour. Anna, if you don't mind my asking, is everything all right? This is quite a departure from your usual approach to family matters." I smiled, though he couldn't see it. "Everything is exactly as it should be, James. For the first time in years, actually." I hung up the phone and ordered room service eggs Benedict and fresh fruit, coffee with real cream, orange juice freshly squeezed. I sat by the window, watching planes take off into the morning sky, each one carrying people toward new beginnings, new possibilities, new chapters in their stories. For the first time in years, I felt like I was flying too. The first crack in their perfect world came at the grocery store that afternoon. Marina called me, her voice tight with confusion and irritation. I watched the phone buzz against the hotel nightstand but didn't answer. Then came a text. Card declined at Whole Foods. WTF. Call the bank ASAP. I deleted it without responding, feeling a small surge of satisfaction at her assumption that I would drop everything to solve her problems. By evening, David was calling. 7 times in a row, each call more insistent than the last. I watched the phone buzz against the hotel nightstand like an angry insect, each vibration a small tremor in the foundation of their entitled assumptions. Finally, he left a voicemail. His voice was irritated but not yet panicked, still operating under the assumption that this was some kind of banking error rather than a deliberate action with serious consequences. Mom, where are you? Something's wrong with the account. Our mortgage payment got declined, and Marina's card isn't working. This has to be some kind of mistake. Call me back as soon as you get this. Marina's freaking out about the mortgage, and we need to get this sorted out before it affects our credit. Marina's freaking out. Not, I'm worried. Not, we miss you. Not, I'm sorry. Just concern about credit scores and financial inconvenience. As if my entire existence could be reduced to a banking glitch that needed fixing. I turned off the phone's ringer and went for a walk through downtown Chicago, something I hadn't done in years. The city had changed since Paul and I used to come here for anniversary dinners and theater performances, but it still thrummed with energy and possibility. I bought myself a cashmere scarf-soft gray wool, the color of lake mist, from a boutique that sold beautiful things to women who understood that sometimes you had to invest in your own happiness. I ate a piece of New York cheesecake at a little cafe on Michigan Avenue, savoring each bite without worrying about anyone else's dietary preferences or aesthetic sensibilities. The cheesecake was rich and decadent and completely unnecessary, which made it the perfect choice for a woman who was rediscovering the pleasure of making decisions based solely on her own desires. By the next day, panic had crept into David's voice like frost creeping across a window. Mom, I called the bank. Henderson said you froze the account. What does that mean? Is this some kind of joke? Mom, that's our money. We can't pay for the house, the cars, everything. Please call me back. I don't understand what I did wrong. He didn't understand. That was exactly the problem. He genuinely had no comprehension.